destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, July 5th, 2023. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are still on our July 4th break. Let's pull up Emma. Is she up there with me?
Hi.
We're still on our July 4th break. On the program today, we have a rerun of an interview that we did with Dale Kretz. He was visiting assistant professor of history at University of California, Santa Barbara, author of Administering Freedom, the State of Emancipation After the Freedmen's Bureau. This ran on my birthday.
And it's on Reconstruction.
And it's on Reconstruction. That was it.
It's like, literally the best gift you could have ever received.
The best gift I could have ever received. Why are we running it? Well, you know, we have this weird thing with our best ofs that we don't do best ofs. We do the best of the year, but we don't really count anything that happens in like late November or December.
Yeah, no later.
Because you're not going to replay the thing from like 3 weeks ago.
Right.
So some of our best ofs don't get the replay that they deserve. And this is the way we were going to do that. Now, Emma, what did you do for the 4th?
I don't know, because it's in the future.
Well,
I hated America and dwelled on all the sins and felt shame, basically.
I said, this is nothing like Juneteenth. We should do away with this holiday.
Like, did we already celebrate basically
the real
this sort
independence?
Of thing?
I used to, when I was younger, I used to have like, it would like a mild, like I would, there would be too much sort of like extracurriculars involved. And then I would like get too down into like, this is all we're doing is celebrating war. Because, you know, those fireworks, you know where the idea for the fireworks came from, incidentally.
The
like,
racist song that we still have as our national anthem.
But also cannons. Like,
Right.
I mean, it's not like.
I don't like fireworks, I
But-
will say that, especially because it's mean to dogs. It's not nice to dogs, and you got to be nice to dogs if you want to hang out with me.
But I will say, I'm with the kids. We have, if everything has gone well, we have traveled from Durham, North Carolina, up into West Virginia, into Virginia, and maybe in D.C., maybe we saw, like, I don't know.
Why are you posting your assassination coordinates?
Oh, but I'm doing it after the fact.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
right.
so try and get me now. That was yesterday and the other day. Nice try. So,
well done.
Yep, there we go. That was the trip, folks. Hopefully it went well.
Yeah.
I mean, God knows.
Better than Disney World?
We were doing a lot of driving. Yeah, so we'll see. But I think we went into a river.
I hope.
Not with a car.
Oh, good.
Yeah, with a boat. Anyways, hope you guys had a great 4th of July. Emma's going to be here tomorrow, live in studio with everybody. And I'll be back on Friday. Now, sit back, enjoy this rebroadcast of an interview we did on November 28th, 2022. Back when I turned, I was like, it was my 82nd birthday, I think it was. Dale Kretz, a visiting assistant professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, wrote Administering Freedom, the State of Emancipation After the Freedmen's Bureau. I know that sounds dry, but this is really fascinating history. So stick around for this. You'll enjoy it. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report. On the phone, Dale Kretz. He's a visiting assistant professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. The author of Administering Freedom, the State of Emancipation After the Freedmen's Bureau. Dale, thanks for joining us on the program. As a birthday present to me, we are talking about some element of Reconstruction. Always one of my favorite topics to talk about. So Really glad that you could be here for this. This is a really interesting a perspective on, or I guess lens in which to take a look at Reconstruction and why/how it failed, as opposed to sort of like the political aspects of it. Although this is, I don't know that you can fully divorce this aspect, but the administrative ability to fulfill, I guess, the promise of Reconstruction. Yeah. So let's just start first with, like, give us a general context of like what the federal government's capacity was, not just in the context of fulfilling, Reconstruction, but just broadly speaking. Like, we had no income tax at that time. Mm-hmm. Give us a sense of like what was the federal government capable of doing, I guess, entering into the Civil War and then, sort of afterwards.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So before the Civil War, the national government did not have that great a presence in the lives of ordinary Americans, be they citizens or subjects. The growth of the federal government was a product of the Civil War, not a prelude to it. Mm-hmm. And we see this especially with the federal intervention during the Civil War. This requires, on the Union's part, a massive mobilization of resources and a massive aggrandizement of federal authority in order to fully marshal all of the resources necessary to defeat the rebellion in the South. And so this military buildup also accompanied an administrative buildup, and the creation, really, for the first time, of a sizable administrative state. Scholars like to talk about a Yankee Leviathan that emerges during the Civil War and continues after the Civil War to really structure the American political economy from the top down. And generally, that's one of the two stories that historians of Reconstruction have told. The story of the growth of the central state, the new northern image of the political economy being imposed on the nation as a whole, and the inauguration of the Gilded Age. That's generally one story of Reconstruction that's centered in the North, and the second story is typically a story that is centered in the South. It's a story of the destruction of slavery. It's a story of the rise of Jim Crow, and these two stories generally don't ever intersect in the historiography. So one effort that I make in the book is to tie these two stories together to show how the 4 million emancipated men, women, and children were actually critical actors in the building of the administrative state. They shaped it and they challenged it at every turn and really tried to wring from it a rapidly diminishing promise of emancipation, which looked very, very different in the crucible of war than it would by the end of the century.
All right, and before we move on to like those visions of what emancipation means, so the expansion of authority, that seems like it's not hard for me to intuit like what that may have meant. We have the ability to, to take these goods here, or to, your farm is going to be a place where you're going to house some Union soldiers for a period of time, or we're going to need your I don't know, your ships to bring our soldiers down the river. Like we've expanded our authority there. And in terms of like the non-military sort of like bureaucracy, like what would have been created? Like, I guess maybe like we need procurement for uniforms. And so there has to be something built out there that isn't directly military, but how does it look? Like were there new departments created? Were there new cabinet secretaries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Pension Bureau had existed before. It was established in the 1830s, and during the Civil War in 1862, lawmakers realized that they could no longer administer pensions the way that they had before. And this story really underscores the relationship between the wartime state and the welfare state. So the need for the Union to take care of its soldiers, it's injured soldiers, it's, widows, it's orphans. This was, a widely understood need that the, federal government had during the Civil War. And so it really had to, embark on a new institutional way to administer social welfare to, these most deserving of recipients, Union veterans and their dependents.
And to be clear, the existence of the Pension Bureau was always about people who had, was always about vets, essentially.
Generally, yeah. And so this really began, the national government and state governments began paying pensions to Revolutionary War veterans first, and these programs generally expanded to include their widows, and then more lateral ties of dependency and more, vertical ties of dependency as well. Increasing liberality is how scholars generally describe the growth of the pension system, and this liberality really, catapults during the Civil War beyond all previous recognition. It doesn't just expand; it also becomes institutionalized in a way that, was rather unpredictable and rather unstoppable, such that by the end of the 19th century, the payment of pensions to Union veterans and heirs consumed well over a third of the federal budget. This is a massive chunk of federal expenditures going to pensions, and that created its own set of political struggles between, Republicans who designed the pension program and administered it as, faithfully as they could, and the, reactionary Democrats who objected to any sort of, federal largesse, particularly when it's on behalf of Union veterans, their families, and veterans of the U.S. colored troops as well. So this is always a political struggle, even though it was, embedded in this emerging, administrative state, which, many people regard as beyond the grasp or the glimpse of the general population.
Is the Pension Bureau the only, entering into the war and maybe just coming directly, entering into the war before we get into like any type of the Reconstruction legislation? Is that really the only, or clearly it was the primary if it's a third of the budget, but was it the only sort of mechanism the federal government had to deliver benefits to Americans? I imagine there may have been other sort of like narrow subsets of Americans, but was there, agrarian subsidies or maybe some support for farm? What was there anything else, or that was it just like 1/3 is pensions for people who served in the war? The other 2/3 are more or less to wage war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were other efforts, especially during the war itself, so-called domestic efforts that the Republican-dominated Congress was able to pass without any Democratic opposition to speak of, really. So the prime example here would be the Homestead Act of 1862, which was a Republican plan to open the West for white settlement, and this afforded white families who were willing to move west a plot of land that they could buy from the government for incredibly cheap, and they could expect to have their homesteads defended by the might of the federal army. So this was one of several positive endeavors, you could say, in the sense that it's not taking away, it's trying to build something and expand something, and it was pioneered during the Civil War. There were antecedents to it, but nothing on the scale that we see during the war itself. Again, this is a responsibility that the national government undertook. Different state governments had different programs for, encouraging one sort of social phenomenon or another. There were different programs for redress or, reparations on an individual scale, but nothing like the, massive social welfare programs that you see inaugurated during and, for decades after the Civil War. The Civil War really was the catalyst for the new way of thinking about what the federal government was capable of doing.
Catalog for us, to the extent that you can, the various visions of what it would mean to free the slaves. I guess entering into the Civil War. It ranges from we're going to free the enslaved, and then we're going to ship them to Africa to, a certain measures of integration. And then I would imagine also we're going to make sure that these people become full citizens. It's not enough. There's a difference between, well, you're no longer enslaved and then you're a full citizen. I mean, that's a different, a state of being. Will you catalog for us those different visions and who may have represented them, or what political forces may have represented those different visions?
It's a great question, and it's one of the prime questions of the antebellum period. It's one of the major reasons why emancipatory projects weren't enacted. The vision of what a post-slavery United States would look like, and there were many different competing visions as well. So ranging from the conservative, which you had mentioned, the colonization plans to, deport newly freed men, women, and children, quote unquote, back to Africa. That was entertained by, many Republicans on the right. There were other programs which would essentially mimic the British example in the West Indies of inaugurating a kind of apprenticeship system whereby the newly emancipated wouldn't be free fully. They wouldn't be, fully accorded the rights of citizenship, as you also mentioned, but instead they would enter into a period of apprenticeship for, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whereby they continue working for their ex-enslavers, except for a wage this time, with certain, regulatory apparatuses organizing, conduct between former enslavers and the formerly enslaved. Again, that was also a more conservative vision. The more radical visions, which were, voiced by the abolitionists, by Black abolitionists in particular, did entail not just a full undoing of the slavers' regime, but also the immediate inauguration of citizenship rights for the formerly enslaved, as well as, voting rights, and above all, more than anything else, land, the redistribution of land held by enslavers. And there was a lot of land to speak of. During the Civil War, the radical Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives identified 70,000 arch traders, as he called them, which had, I think, 400 million acres of land. And he proposed to seize this land and redistribute it to, some 800,000 Black families, which would have been more than enough for 40 acres for each family. I think each family would have gotten a 500-acre tract if that vision had been enacted. So there are, as you said, a lot of different competing visions of what the post-slavery world would look like, ranging from the conservative to the more radical, which was again voiced by abolitionists, radicals, and especially Black abolitionists.
And we should say arch traders in the sense that they're not trading things, but they were traitors to the United States. They were rebels in that sense.
Exactly.
All right, and one more question on this before we move forward. How much, because I'm fascinated by the idea that we see time and time again in moments like these, and across this, it's really, I guess, intellectual history. But it's also very political in the sense that how developed were these different visions, and how much were the development of these different visions how much did that play a part in whether they got executed? Right? I mean, we see that, does that make sense? We see this all the time where, the right has been always very good, at least in this modern era, of if we elect somebody, we've got a list of, 12 justices that we want. Or if we elect, we're going to pull these different policies off the shelf and we're going to implement them. They're all just tax cuts, but, it's been my experience that the left doesn't do that as much. But you can also see this dynamic. I studied religious studies. People have a vision of it's this religion. If they get kicked out of the temple, then this will take prominence because it'll be more suited towards a non-temple based religion type of situation. How developed were these different visions, and how much after the war were the development of those visions predictive as to what we got?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So how were these different ideologies planned? How were they operationalized as well? I mean, in some respects, the Civil War caught a lot of radicals by surprise. I mean, they had wished for a rebellion so that they could use the federal government to swiftly emancipate all of the enslaved, which, didn't happen as swiftly as they had wanted, but nevertheless it happened. And so many who had been thinking about what a post-emancipation South and United States would look like were sort of caught off guard in one way or another. But we see them, scrambling during the war itself to operationalize their visions. And they were improvising in many ways. They didn't have necessarily a set blueprint that they would propose on the floor and debate on the floor. Instead, it was rather, developed on the fly in response to on-the-ground conditions, which varied widely across the 750,000 square miles of the wartime South. And we see this especially, I think, most pronounced in the struggle over the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was passed on March 3rd, 1865, in the waning days of the war. And the main struggle was between radicals like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who wanted to house the so-called Emancipation Bureau in the Treasury Department. More conservative Republicans wanted to house it in the War Department, and they won out. And this debate mattered a great deal because whether it was housed in the War or Treasury Department would signal the permanence of that institution. If it was in the War Department, then it was temporary. It was a wartime measure, set to expire when the war expired. If it was in the Treasury Department, like the radicals wanted, this would be a more permanent feature. You would have this, first federal endeavor in social welfare on the behalf of the recently emancipated, embedded in the, federal state for many years to come. It wouldn't be, tethered to the continuance of the, slaveholders' rebellion. And so again, the radicals lost out there, and a number of other conservative elements sort of ate away at the, grander, more radical vision of the radicals for the Freedmen's Bureau. Above all, the, initial charter that the Bureau had to redistribute to the formerly enslaved all of the lands that had been acquired during the Civil War, because the, enslavers either abandoned that land or the U.S. Army took it by force. The Army had a great deal of land by, the dawn of 1865, and the question was what to do with it. The land was effectively nationalized, and so having this land was a way to basically allow these different visions of emancipation to take root. This was a sort of blank canvas, more or less blank canvas, on which different, abolitionist-minded politicians could paint their picture. And we see different projects enacted during the war, and eventually, a different federal consensus on what that particular agency would look like, and it came in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yeah, I found that you writing about that distinction between where it ends up was, to me, sort of like almost the whole ball game on some level. Like, everything that happens after that is, in many ways, it feels like almost predetermined. Once you make that first decision, we're going to put it in the War Department as opposed to the Treasury. And where did the land that the Army conquers, let's say, who's in charge of that? Like, I get the Army, we need to administer it right now, but on whose books is that? Who keeps the ledger? We've got this land. It's the United States' land at this point. Where is that? There's no, land. We don't have a Bureau of Land Management at that point. Who's got the books on that land?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and it really depended. The possession of the land was one thing, but the legal possession of it was another, and these were not, strict categories. If, the federal government claimed it via the U.S. Army because a rebel planter abandoned it, they didn't necessarily have title deed to it. And with Andrew Johnson's pardon, he essentially invited those former enslavers and ex-planters back onto their lands with general amnesty. And the question is, who who was running these plantations during the war? On some plantations, you have, military officials running it, paying wages to the formerly enslaved, now, not quite citizens, but, not quite enslaved, in sort of like liminal space. You'd have military officials running these plantations. On other plantations, you had the federal government essentially selling it to northern lessees. So you'd have northern businessmen believing in this, free labor ideology that they could run a plantation better than the slaveholders, and they would come down. Many of them came down during the Civil War to buy land from the federal government on the cheap, and essentially, try and enact their free labor visions, believing that if you pay workers, wages, even small wages, they'll work harder than if you threaten them with violence, like the slaveholders did. And so there's, a widespread class of northern planters that come down during the war. And this was another way in which the federal government was trying to finance the Civil War in the middle of the Civil War by selling these lands, by collecting, revenue from the sale of cotton on these northern run, military-backed plantations. And for the freed people having to work it, this was a really dismal view of what freedom would look like. Right? They essentially regarded this as a form of quasi-slavery. They found that their northern, employers could be just as harsh as their southern slave masters. They imposed all sorts of rules. They, had curfew. They begged the army to allow them to enact corporal punishment on their, workers. And, this was a system that, rubbed many formerly enslaved men and women the wrong way. And they, seized upon this as further evidence that they are entitled to own that land themselves. They knew that if they had to work land that was owned by somebody else, be they, southern former slaveholder or northern businessman turned planter, that they were not truly free. Land ownership was the central tenet of Black freedom. That was what they held on to doggedly for many years, and many of them believed that there was going to be widespread land redistribution come January 1st, 1865. And many were, sorely disappointed that that didn't come to pass, and that the Freedmen's Bureau, which they believed was the vehicle, the instrument to actually redistribute these lands and give, freed people titles to the land, that initial promise was diminished. It was bankrupt. It was, stolen, and they no longer were able to claim land in any sort of legal sense. It was only a moral claim that they could make, and they did make it through the turn of the century into the 20th century.
It's just amazing to imagine if that had happened at that time, which is not to say that we don't have evidence of how it could be reversed. I mean, certainly we had, what amounts to pogroms in various states around the country where there was sort of Black wealth and Black political power developed. But if that political power and wealth was rooted in widespread ownership of land, it becomes a lot harder to have those sort of like isolated moments, and the federal government has to respond more to these people because they have more political power. And it's almost like a once and done type of situation that would have, more likely than not had created a trajectory that would have really fundamentally changed where this country would be today in terms of like just politics and the questions of race and So what did happen with the Freedmen Bureau? How did the bureaucratic operations of it inhibit this? And how do you distinguish between the political will that existed in the sort of like strictly political arena from bureaucratic obstacles, and how much were those bureaucratic obstacles influenced by a lack of political will?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely a vicious cycle there. So it's partly a question of political will, partly a question of ideological vision, partly a question of state capacity, and all of these things really intermixed and resulted in a Freedmen's Bureau that was manifestly incapable of executing any sort of will in any consistent manner. I mean, the to start with funding. So the Freedmen's Bureau, the amount of funding it received for the 7 years of its existence was equivalent to what the Union government spent executing the war for 1 day. That was the amount of money that was given to the Freedmen's Bureau for 7 years. It was wildly understaffed, spread across a massive territory.
1 day of war
1 day executing the war.
Wow.
So that shows you, where priorities lay. The Union government was dedicated to winning the war, but not necessarily winning the peace for, the formerly enslaved men, women, and children in the South. This was, one of the primary hurdles, and the lack of funding, the lack of, staffing and manpower, the withdrawal of the U.S. Army from the South in the early 1870s really prevented the Bureau from being anything but a kind of, federal figurehead, just a kind of vestige of authority. These, scattered Freedmen's Bureau outposts across the South could do little more than, manage contracts that, came in front of them. It could report on, white terrorist violence that gripped the South, but it didn't really have the power to enforce anything. And it could have been different. It would have taken, more money to begin with. It would have taken a greater plan. It would have taken more of a political will in Congress. And there was, something of a strong will at the beginning, at least when it was founded, at least when the radicals in Congress took over the Reconstruction project from President Johnson, who was, very much sympathetic to former slaveholders and, vehemently hated freed people. There was ways in which, the Freedmen's Bureau could have been more robust, and it simply wasn't. It didn't have the money, it didn't have the manpower. And so by the end, by 1872, when it officially closed its doors, all it was doing was, running a few hospitals, running a few schools, reviewing a few labor contracts, and most importantly for my work, it was fulfilling the claims, the bounty and pension claims of men who had served in the USCT, as well as their dependents. This was one function that it could do, and it speaks to the rather dramatic constricting of what the Freedmen's Bureau was capable of doing, but also what freedom meant. It would not mean inclusion in a large state powerful enough to make your rights felt and meaningful. Instead, what the federal government via the Freedmen's Bureau was capable of doing was fulfilling individual claims, means testing individual entitlements, and maybe getting very stringent benefits delivered to a handful of the 4 million freed people it was intended to serve. And so it's a real blow to the Black freedom struggle, and they recognize it, like on the ground. They saw how embattled the Freedmen's Bureau was. They saw it diminishing before their very eyes, and they mobilized to fight it, but they could only do so much from their positions of dramatic disempowerment.
What how much of that was just simply at the time there wasn't the how conscious was, or I guess let's talk about the struggle to set it up, because it is again another one of those things where it's like, you can predict what's going to happen in the future by how you set it up in that moment, and where its funding comes from, under whose auspices it is. Is it? Because we can look at things like Social Security. We can look at things like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, like the way that it was set up, where its funding doesn't come from Congress, so it sort of has like a quasi-independence that Congress, a hostile Congress can't shut it down in the way that it could maybe, attack like the IRS for that matter or something. What were the key features that made it? Was it just simply like, you guys have 7 years to do this, or was there some other like mechanism to term limited, and was its funding tied in a certain way that it was specifically, there was a ticking time bomb associated with it? Like what were the intricacies of the way that it was set up that made it sort of set up to fail?
It was designed to run on its own revenue. essentially. So it had to pay for itself, not just in terms of, the sort of bare bones financing of it, but also ideologically. Democrats hated the Freedmen's Bureau, and Republicans, were tired of the Freedmen's Bureau being a lightning rod of political conflict. They were tired of, the Freedmen's Bureau essentially being the Reconstruction project writ small, right? So they had to, vigorously defend the Freedmen's Bureau against all sorts of charges that, this was an unconstitutional intervention in the South, in the, post-war South, because, the rebel armies had surrendered. There's no reason why this wartime agency should still be in existence. There's no reason why there should be, a federal welfare agency set up to take care of a particular class of, individuals. We wouldn't say citizens just yet.
So there's the war. I mean, the wartime thing, that's where we see the relevance of it being in the War Department as opposed into being into Treasury, because that's one reason why you attack it. Why do we need it? The war is over.
Definitely. Yeah. So its funds did not come from elsewhere. It had to be self-generating, self-supporting in a way in order to ward off charges of fraud, but especially dependency, right? So there's a widespread fear, even among Republicans, that the formerly enslaved, even recently removed from slavery just months prior, would become quote unquote dependent on the federal government. They wouldn't want to work. They would just want to receive, welfare benefits from the federal government. That was the fear.
So in other words, the safety net would become a hammock.
Essentially, yeah.
I mean, that's a good way to put it. That's the thing, is that this none of this dynamic, the same thing we're hearing 200 some odd years later, and so, but what was the statutory authority they had to raise money? Like, what was the mechanism in which, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does it from bank fees, and they have the statutory authority to collect certain bank fees, and that's the way they finance their operations, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what was the Freedom Bureau's, the Freedmen's Bureau's statutory authority to collect money?
Well, I mean, the largest resource that it had was confiscated lands. So those nationalized lands that it had in its authority, nominally at least, that was its primary source of revenue, right? So because it had to fund its own operations, and because it had all of this land, it essentially sold it back to anyone who would buy it. It sold it back to planters. It returned it to planters. Only in some cases was the land basically given to select formerly enslaved families on like the Georgia and South Carolina low country who were able to produce and maintain some small hold. But by and large, it was land. It was its own land that the Freedmen's Bureau used in order to finance its operations and to try and ward off charges of dependency and excess and unconstitutional continuance of this wartime agency. So it was really hamstrung from the beginning, and it was a real self-inflicted wound as well. And all of it goes back to, as you were saying, its initial charter, the initial situation of the Freedmen's Bureau in the War Department instead of the Treasury Department, a more permanent agency where its funding can come from an external source or from like general taxation, and it would be more insulated from political attacks. But in fact, it wasn't. In fact, this first federal experiment in social welfare really set the stage for this very peculiar American combination of anti-Black racism and anti-statism. That is, the sort of crux of the American assault on social welfare programs. It didn't just begin in the 1960s or the 1930s. It was the 1860s that you really see the roots of this racist attack on social welfare provisioning.
I mean, that's where the whole states' rights thing, right? You don't want the federal government to come in and tell us how we're going to operate. And when people talk about the sort of failure of Reconstruction, it really was like a function of half measures that didn't fundamentally sort of say, like, you've lost. You're going to now, like, for the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to be in the role of essentially like a land that has been, for lack of a better term, conquered or defeated, and you're going to reorient yourself in such a way. And that never that never happened. And we live with that, the implications of that today. I want to return back to just sort of the lessons about that bureaucracy for today, particularly for those of us on the left, because really these bureaucracies and these agencies exist only for people who are looking to have government function for people, right? I mean, it's like almost like fundamentally a left project, except for maybe elements of the national security state, which are to sort of inhibit democracy in some way. But before we get there, I want to talk about like what was happening with, because you write about the populist movement that took place there, and the sort of and we've touched on this in the past on this program, like in the context of I think was what was happening in North Carolina, South Carolina, and the ways of which the white people were trying to remove black political power by appealing to populists who were like, we don't really care about the racism as much as we care about the fact that you guys are really wealthy and not sharing any of that money. Talk briefly about what happened with with the populist movement and the attempt to sort of bridge to create a bridge with recently unenslaved people, I guess, as a political project, and how that collapsed.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So the populist movement, especially in the late 19th century, is one of the more understudied phenomena in American political history, and especially the populist movement in the South, which really began in the 1880s. It sort of sprang from different like farmers associations and farmers collectives, white and black. They were generally segregated, but there was widespread agrarian unrest owing to falling cotton prices and so forth in the 1870s and the 1880s. And so these different like farmers collectives sprang up, and they essentially provided the kind of seedbed for what would later become the populist movement, embodied in the People's Party. And in the South, we have essentially a democratic state that was taken over during Reconstruction. When you have Republican state governments, the Democrats were able to take it over, and so there's a kind of two-party stasis in the South, with the Democrats basically having a stranglehold on all seats of power. What the populist movement did in the South was rattle that two-party system. The populists presented a major challenge to the political establishment in a way that was seldom glimpsed before or since. And again, in the South in particular, the formerly enslaved, black Southerners were not yet disenfranchised. That would not start happening until 1890. So in the 1880s, you have this, rather remarkable political period between Reconstruction and the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, when black people were still voting in sizable numbers, able to tip elections in many counties. Yep. And so populists, rather savvily appealed to black voters, and black populists really took the initiative in mobilizing the black vote on behalf of favored candidates that would listen to the demands of farmers, black and white alike. And so there was a great deal of synthesis between the white populists of the South and the black populists. But as you mentioned, it always foundered on the issue of race. Right? So black populists were far more interested in issues of civil rights, anti-lynching legislation, and so forth, than white populists were. They both shared an economic vision, but in terms of a social vision, white populists didn't want to rock the boat with pushing for civil rights or the federal oversight of elections. And ultimately, that lack of a bridge over social and civil issues was really what destroyed the populist movement in the South. And we see it eventually captured by the Democratic Party in the mid-1890s. But there was a remarkable moment, as I said, where things could have turned out very differently. It could have been a more, populist-inflected political landscape, especially in the South and the West, where the populists were most strong.
And to be clear, when you say captured by the Democratic Party, that the capture from an in terms of like identifying and in terms of like working into the apparatus of the party, followed an ideological sort of like almost virus, if you will, through the populists, where they became increasingly racist, right? I mean, and it was coming. I mean, the Democrats were racist at that time too, and so that's where it came. But the folding into the Democratic Party was a second order issue from the sort of the racial resent. Yeah. And I think this is important because this is like the sort of the story that keeps coming up in American politics. You know, The Hammer and the Hoe was a book that we've discussed on this program, like in the 20s, where there was an attempt to build a working class solidarity between black communists and it was Robin Kelly, black communists and white working people. And again, this falls apart because of, I don't know if it's just like a pure racist ideology or if it's just because you have, and it's so obvious when you're 15 years out from 4 million people being enslaved. Like, how do you have a political movement that is not going to involve their material interests being redress the things that made us slaves, right? Like both economically, but also in terms of like civil rights, like the right to vote, like the right to be recognized as a human being, the right to not have our families separated. Like that's going to be on your mind 15 years out from slavery, 20 years out from slavery. I would argue even 100 years out from slavery, maybe more. There was just an incredible reluctance, or at least a palpable, incredible reluctance, or at least a palpable tendency to ignore those being legitimate material interests for your partners there.
Yeah, exactly. And, the Democratic establishment during the 1890s, it really race-baited and red-baited the populists to death. It painted the populists of the 1890s as, essentially the Republican Party of the 1850s. And black voters sort of made that association as well. They said, the Populist Party today, the People's Party today, is essentially like what the Abolitionist Party of the 1850s was to us back then. It's now going to deliver us from political bondage, which was the phrase that they often used. And so, increasingly in the South, you had, populists being the only party that was appealing to black voters. Sometimes even, running black voters for office. Even the Republican Party in the South, after Reconstruction, enforced what was called the Lily White policy. They would only support white people for office. And this was the party that was supposed to be, the closest in, allegiance to the formerly enslaved. And so we really see, a coordinated assault from the political establishment targeting populists as radicals and as, essentially the party of black domination. And yes, eventually, a number of white populists, key white populists, caved. And the Democratic Party agreed to, nominally accept a few of their demands into their, Democratic Party platform, basically, paying lip service to agrarian unrest. And with that, it destroyed the Populist Party, and Jim Crow could finally be inaugurated. This is another very important aspect of this period in history, which is often forgotten. Jim Crow only was able to be instituted at the state level across the South after the defeat of the populist insurgency. The first state to inaugurate a Jim Crow system statewide was Mississippi in 1890. It didn't have a populist threat. It could call for a state constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution without worrying about populists taking over the convention and rewriting that to their ends. The next state was South Carolina in 1895. Still, there were populists active in 1895, not so much in South Carolina. The other states had to wait until their populist threat was neutralized in order to call for a state convention to inaugurate Jim Crow. So really, it's not until the crushing of the populist movement that we see the full instantiation of, what we would recognize today as a Jim Crow system in the South. The Populist Party was a sort of last gasp at, staving off, a sort of, straight up racist society in the South for, generations.
So I want to talk about like sort of lessons that we get to today. And we should say that you're, in addition to being a historian, you are a union organizer for the nurses union in California, which is one of the most, I think, radical or active unions in the country, more or less. And so I want to talk about like sort of the lessons that we can learn, from what we were just talking about, like because this is something that has been roiling the progressive left, and it has been this sort of, do we get bogged down, material interests versus like, I guess, civil rights. On some level, there's this sort of like false dichotomy, or I perceive it as a false dichotomy that is brought up in some sectors of the left. And the lessons that I take from like what happened to the populists is that you cannot abandon the civil rights agenda, because without it, you simply do not have, you're ignoring what are the legitimate material interests of such a wide sector of who's going to make up a genuine left in this country. Right.
Yeah. And the California Nurses Association, which is the union that I work for as a labor representative, we are, a militant trade union, and we are a social movement, and we take very seriously racial justice. We recognize that racial justice is integral to workers' rights. You can't have one without the other. And the lessons of that association are clear if you look back at American history in the 20th century, or even in the 19th century, as we've been discussing today. So foregrounding racial justice and social justice is all incredibly important to actually giving workers greater democracy in the workplace, and to expand those rights beyond the workplace to the nation at large. When we're talking about one of the primary political goals of the nurses union, that's Medicare for all. It's single payer healthcare, taking this vital public function outside of market imperatives, and using that as a kind of way to build a more robust social welfare state that takes care of everybody, without qualification, without condition, free at the point of service. Again, insulating it from market imperatives, from privatization, and from means testing. Really, the only way to accomplish that feat, and to really liberate people from the market in a very like human flesh and blood sense, is to have single payer healthcare.
All right. Well, I want to get to that in terms of like the left's perspective on bureaucracy. But when you say that social justice is integral to delivering for a working class movement, is that on as a political matter, in terms of like a movement building matter, or in terms of like an agenda matter, or is it both? And can you address those separately? Because as a political matter, it seems like, I think people are like, well, I can't understand it as an agenda matter, where it's like too hard for people to, how do I reconcile, like, what if it's a universal program, then what difference does it make if it's black or white people who get it at that point? But to me, it's like, I think it's a much easier sort of like obvious, like as a political matter, like there's just not enough. Mm-hmm. Like if you want working class power, you have to address the social justice aspect of a tremendous amount of working class people in this country, because their set of agenda there is longstanding, and there's just this incredible sort of like history in this country of like for them to have political power, it involves like what we call social justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the key to it isn't, targeted and means tested social programs, because those make, rather easy targets, and they never deliver benefits the way that you would expect them to deliver benefits. And and sometimes they're cynically used by those in the center to basically pay lip service to issues of social justice and to tout their own bona fides in terms of being able to recognize marginalized groups and give them targeted programs which essentially amount to more or less tax deductions, and that's not a way to build empowered citizens. You build empowered citizens with policies that are universal. Universal policies will disproportionately help those who have been disproportionately harmed. And as a point of organizing, you need to organize across all of these artificial lines that have been created by the capitalist class to divide workers against themselves and to distract from the larger project of workplace organizing, workplace justice, and workplace democracy. And so as a point of organizing, you need to overcome those artificial and imposed social barriers in order to actually get these programs enacted. And these programs, again, as I've said, need to be universal. Everybody in, nobody out. That's the only way that you can actually fully redistribute benefits, and to not have these sorts of programs targeted in the same way, or at least in a similar way that people targeted these particular agencies in the 1860s and 70s for only intervening on behalf of one particular class of citizens. Like there needs to be a more permanent, universal, and comprehensive program that benefits everybody. That's the only way to actually achieve justice, and especially justice for workers, the vast majority of the population.
Let's talk about the lessons that you see in terms of the left's relationship to the bureaucracy, right? Like we know what the right's relationship to the bureaucracy is. We don't want it unless it really involves like the national security state or the military, the police. That's it. All done because we want business to be able to do whatever it can at the, basically externalize its costs to society, maybe different cohorts of society or just society at large, or to the environment or whatnot. And then we keep all the profits, and that's the way we create a bigger profit margin. But what is to the extent that there's a left critique of, is there a left critique of bureaucracy, or is there a left critique of the execution in certain circumstances of bureaucracy? I mean, this is this is sort of to me, it's like where people say like, I am against regulation. What? How you can be against regulation? Like, I'm not for, just because I'm pro regulation doesn't mean I'm pro every regulation, right? Like, will you just sort of parse that out a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. Is there a left critique of bureaucracy? Well, certainly not on the scale of...
Or should there even be a left critique of bureaucracy writ large versus specific bureaucracies, like specific execution of bureaucracy?
Yeah, that's a really provocative question. I mean, I think that there should be a broad left critique of bureaucracy, and it should acknowledge the right critique of bureaucracy, which is essentially sabotaging these administrative agencies from the inside, and then pointing at them and saying, look how terrible they are. I think we need to privatize all of them. Like that's been the right sort of approach to defanging and declawing any sort of bureaucracy outside the punitive ones.
Post office to Social Security to IRS. I mean, we just see it on and on and on. FDA. I mean, everything.
Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, yeah, that's how they undermine those social policies. And the left really hasn't had an answer. They say, bureaucracy is bad. It's frustrating, but we should just keep it around. It's very weak. It's very room temperature. And I think a robust left critique, which I think this book contributes to, at least in a historical sense, the beginning of a kind of left critique of bureaucracy, that ought to be rooted in our vision of a universal social welfare state. That in fact means testing and privatization is what expands the bureaucracy. It's what gives administrators and bureaucrats greater power and discretion and control over our lives. It's what produces beleaguered subjects instead of empowered citizens. You can only have empowered citizens when they have, positive experiences with the state, especially when it comes to things like, healthcare or other forms of social welfare. There shouldn't be, mountains of paperwork to fill out in order to get benefits, right? You shouldn't have to. If you're an ordinary American, you shouldn't have to really ever talk to a federal bureaucrat. Like that should be the ideal, right? The administrative burden should be on the administration itself or on employers, right? And that's when you're talking about regulations. We still need regulations, and we still need administrative agencies to regulate things like, the EPA. But the burden should not be on individual workers. It should be on employers to comply with those regulations. Most Americans aren't employers; they're employees. They're workers, and so they would not really be harmed by increased regulations or an expanded regulatory state. What they are harmed by is the punitive apparatus of the federal government, the NSA, the police state. These institutions are how most Americans encounter the federal government in a punitive sense. In a sort of mundane administrative sense, we're talking about frustrating programs like the DMV or other bureaucracies that we encounter really on a daily basis, and that shapes our lives and shapes our experience of government and our sense of what government is there for. Right? It's not there for us necessarily. It's there to hold us in suspicion. It's there to frustrate us. It's there to keep us from receiving meager benefits.
How is that articulated? First off, let me just say, I think the DMV gets a bad rap. Honestly, I have 90% of my experience with the DMV have been positive.
I don't mean to take on that in particular.
Let me just say that. But putting that aside, how do we articulate that in an elevator pitch in terms of a bureaucracy? Is it we don't want any bureaucracy that involves individualizing benefits from the government is wrong, but any bureaucracy that is set up to provide universal benefits is right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it would have to acknowledge the harms of means testing and privatization, both of which were forecasted in the 1860s with the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Branch, which has been totally forgotten, right. And the Pension Bureau.
And Freedmen's Branch, we should just say, is the sort of the diminished Freedmen's Bureau.
It continued the work of the Freedmen's Bureau for another 7 years until 1879, basically just fulfilling claims. So that was, the last remaining work of the Freedmen's Bureau, and it lasted well beyond. And, it affected the lives of, thousands of formerly enslaved men, women, and children. And, it's just been totally lost to history. I write about it for the first time in my book, and it's an example of, how Americans generally don't like to think about bureaucracy or remember it, or, give it any sort of, sustained analysis or critique. And, we've done that essentially to our peril, especially on the latter half of the 20th century to today. It's why we're asking these very questions. How should the left talk about bureaucracy?
That's my fear.
Program by now.
That's my fear with a blanket rejection of bureaucracy by the left, is that it falls into that same trap of a blanket regulation, regulatory state. It does not. It becomes a critique of government, which I think is is the wrong tact for the left. It's got to be a more sort of nuanced. It doesn't have to be nuanced per se, but it has to be more exact. And because government is the mechanism in which we have, communitarian programs. I mean, that's it. It is supposed to be at its best the manifestation of our needs and desires for what we want for society.
Absolutely. And, as a sort of, vision for what a left, argument for bureaucracy would look like, we could just look to the experiences that, the formerly enslaved had with, their own federal officials. They recognize the necessity of the federal bureaucracy, right? They're just fighting over its character, right? They're fighting over, its permanence. And so they argue that, the bureaucracy should serve the people. It should be responsive. It shouldn't be burdensome, right? You shouldn't have to fill out mountains of paperwork to get, any sort of benefits, and it should be, responsive to a collective will, right? It should be universal, right? Those are the main tenets of of their, working critique of their relationship with these different federal agencies that I discussed. And, we should take a lesson from that.
Indeed. Dale Kretz, visiting assistant professor of history, University of California, Santa Barbara, author of Administering Freedom, the State of Emancipation After the Freedmen's Bureau. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming on. Fascinating stuff. I love talking about Reconstruction, and it's a great birthday present. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
Anytime.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive,